The desert wind tasted like dust and ghosts. It was a taste Ray knew well, the kind that got into a man's blood and never quite left. He crested the final ridge, the sun bleeding red across the mountains he hadn't seen in 3 long years. 3 years fighting for the army, using his Apache skills to track for men who both valued and despised him. He was a scout, a weapon, an outsider in 2 different worlds. Now, at 31, he was riding home with nothing but a rifle, a weary horse, and a hole in his chest where his heart used to be. He was coming home for June. He could see her in his mind, pale hair shining in the sun, her hands gentle but her eyes defiant. She'd been 19 when she'd married him, a white woman choosing an Apache in a land that spit on such things. They'd carved out a small life on the edge of the world, a cabin filled with the smell of baking bread and the promise of a future. When the soldiers came, he'd left to protect that future, believing his service would buy them peace. "I'll be back soon," he'd promised, kissing her on that porch. That was the last time he saw her. Now, his eyes scanned the valley, searching for the smoke from their chimney, for the shape of the cabin he'd dreamt of during countless cold nights. It was there. But the sight was a punch to the gut. The roof sagged. A shutter hung from a single hinge, swinging in the wind like a broken bone. The garden was choked with weeds, the fence trampled and broken. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a grave. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dead earth. The door groaned open, and the air inside was stale with dust and memory. The table was bare. The quilt she'd stitched was gone. Only silence remained. He had pictured her running into his arms. He had pictured tears of joy. Instead, he found this, an emptiness so complete it echoed. He rode through the valley, asking questions that felt like swallowing glass. The answers came slow, wrapped in pity and suspicion, but the pieces clicked into place, each one colder and sharper than the last. June was alive, but she wasn't his anymore. She was married, and the name they spoke cut deeper than any knife the army had ever thrown at him. Thomas. His stomach clenched into a knot of ice and fire. Not just any man. Thomas had been his closest friend, the man he'd called brother. They had broken horses together, shared whiskey under the stars. Thomas was supposed to be the one man he could trust with his life. Instead, he had taken it. Ray sat by the creek, the water sliding over stones, and tried to breathe. Had she betrayed him? Had Thomas? Or had he just been a fool, a ghost forgotten by a world that kept spinning without him? He'd been gone for 3 years. 3 years, with no word. What had he expected? For her to just wait forever? A bitter thought coiled in his gut. Maybe she'd never really loved him at all. Maybe he was just a wild fantasy, and Thomas was the safe harbor she'd always wanted. That night, he made a small, hidden fire and lay awake, listening to the creek whisper stories of a life that was no longer his. He remembered her laugh, the way she clung to him the night before he left. "Come back to me, Ray," she'd whispered. "Promise me." He had promised, and he had come back. The next morning, he rode into Dry Creek. The town had grown, new saloons and a schoolhouse standing where there had once been only dust. Men watched him pass, their eyes hard. An Apache in town was a storm cloud on the horizon. He ignored them, tying his horse outside the general store. The moment he stepped inside, conversations died. The air grew thick. He gathered coffee, flour, and cartridges, placing them on the counter. His hand rested on the pouch of tarnished army coins at his belt, and that's when he saw her. Through the dusty glass window, there she was. June. The sunlight caught her hair, just like he remembered. She was holding a bolt of cloth, and standing beside her, his hand resting protectively on her elbow, was Thomas. The years had etched new lines on her face, but she was more beautiful than ever. There was a strength in her posture he'd never seen before. Thomas looked at her with a quiet pride that made Ray's blood boil. Then his gaze dropped. A small boy, no more than 3, trotted at her side, clutching a wooden horse. He laughed, a bright, clear sound that shot through Ray's chest like an arrow. The boy turned his head, his face visible for just a single, heart-stopping second, and Ray forgot how to breathe. The child's eyes were dark, almond-shaped, the eyes of his people. His skin was the color of warm bronze, his hair straight and black as a raven's wing. Ray gripped the counter, his knuckles turning white. The boy couldn't be more than 3. 3 years, the exact time he'd been gone. It was a coincidence. It had to be. A trick of the light. But then June bent down to fix the boy's hat, and her eyes lifted, meeting Ray's through the window. Recognition flared, then shock, then a wave of sorrow so profound it was like watching her drown. Before Thomas could turn, before anyone could see, Ray spun on his heel, leaving the supplies on the counter. He mounted his horse and rode out of town like the devil was on his heels, the wind tearing at his face. But it couldn't strip away the image burned into his mind. June, alive, married to Thomas, and a boy with his own eyes staring back at him. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something far deeper, far more twisted, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would not rest until he had the truth. He told himself to keep riding, to leave Dry Creek and never look back. But he couldn't. The memory of the boy's face, of June's haunted eyes, was a rope pulling him back. He rode back to the edge of town, the midday sun high and hot. Peace was a distant memory. All he wanted now were answers, and he didn't care what he had to break to get them. The town was busy. Wagons groaned, cowboys shouted from the saloon. He felt the stares again, the silent judgment. A battle-scarred Apache was a story nobody wanted to hear the end of. He slid off his horse near the livery, and his eyes immediately found her. She was across the street, talking to the blacksmith's wife, a bundle of mended clothes in her arms. The boy was there, tugging at her skirt, impatient and alive. Every beat of Ray's heart was a hammer blow against his ribs. Then Thomas stepped out of the smithy, smiling. He moved with an easy grace, rolling up his sleeves as he walked toward them. He bent down and swung the little boy up onto his broad shoulders, a natural, practiced movement. The boy shrieked with delight. It was the perfect family portrait, and it should have filled Ray with rage, his friend, his woman, and the boy who might be his son. But what he felt was a disorienting wave of confusion. Thomas didn't look like a thief. He looked happy, content. Ray took a step forward. The boardwalk creaked under his boot, and Thomas's head snapped up. His smile vanished. His whole body went still, the easy grace gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. "Ray," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. June spun around. The color drained from her face. She froze, clutching the bundle of clothes to her chest as if it were a shield. The boy on Thomas's shoulders fell silent, looking between the 3 adults with wide, curious eyes. Ray stood in the middle of the dusty street, his hat shadowing his face. "Thomas," he said, his own voice flat, dead. "You're alive." It wasn't a question. It was a prayer, and a curse rolled into one. Thomas gently lowered the boy to the ground, his movements slow, careful, as if the world might shatter. "They said, the letter said you were gone." June finally found her voice, but it was just a whisper. "Ray?" Her lips trembled. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady a heart that was threatening to beat its way out. The boy, sensing the storm, asked in a small voice, "Mama, who's that?" June knelt quickly, her movements jerky. She smoothed his hair back, her eyes never leaving Ray's. "No one, sweetheart. Just an old friend." An old friend. The words were a whip crack. All the questions Ray had been holding back surged forward, burning in his throat. Why did you marry him? Why didn't you wait? Whose son is he? but the street was full of watching eyes, and the air was thick with the promise of gossip that would spread like a plague. Thomas saw it too. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm, meant only for Ray. "Not here. Come to the cabin tonight. We'll talk." Pride screamed at Ray to refuse, to settle this right here and now. But then he saw the unshed tears glistening in June's eyes, and something inside him broke. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he turned and walked away, the whispers of the townspeople following him like hungry dogs. That evening, he waited in the trees as the sky turned to fire and ash. Thomas's cabin was modest, with a small corral and a neat garden. Through the window, he saw the yellow glow of a lamp. He saw the shadows move inside. June setting the table, Thomas lifting the boy into his chair. It was a scene of such simple domestic warmth that it felt like a physical pain. That was supposed to be his life. When Thomas finally stepped out onto the porch, Ray emerged from the shadows. His old friend just looked at him for a long moment, then motioned him inside. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. June kept her back to him, her hands shaking as she washed dishes that were already clean. The boy sat at the table, chewing on a piece of bread, his dark eyes wide with curiosity as he stared at the stranger. His little legs swung back and forth, not yet long enough to touch the floor. Ray couldn't look away from him. Every tilt of the boy's head, every flicker of his expression, was like looking at his own reflection across time. Thomas cleared his throat. "Sit. Eat with us." Ray didn't move. "I didn't come for food." June turned then, her face pale but her gaze finally steady. "Then what did you come for, Ray?" His voice was hard, unforgiving. "For answers." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. June's fingers clenched in her apron. Thomas was the one who broke the silence. "She thought you were dead, Ray. We all did." His tone wasn't defensive. It was just weary truth. "A letter came. From the army. Said you fell in the San Carlos campaign. I saw it myself." Ray frowned, his mind flashing back to a blur of sand, blood, and pain. He'd been wounded, yes. Left for dead in a dry wash. Had the army made a mistake? Or had someone wanted him erased? June's voice trembled when she spoke. I was already heavy with child when the letter came." Her eyes darted toward the boy. "I didn't know how I could go on. I was alone. And then Thomas." Her throat closed, and she had to look away, blinking hard against the tears. "Thomas was there. He helped me when no one else would." Ray's gaze swung from her to Thomas, the storm in his chest about to break. "So you married him." "It wasn't about love, Ray," she cried, the tears finally spilling over. "It was survival. For me and for my baby." The boy looked up at the word baby, his mouth sticky with bread, completely unaware that he was the center of the hurricane that was tearing their world apart. Ray's fists were clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to scream the final question, to force her to say the words. But Thomas's steady gaze held him back, a silent warning that the truth wasn't so simple. Instead, Ray turned for the door. His voice was a low, raw thing. "You built a life without me. I won't stay and watch it." "Ray, wait," June pleaded, reaching out. But he was already gone, stepping out into the cold night air that felt like a slap after the suffocating heat of the cabin. Behind him, he heard a single, muffled sob from June, quickly stifled for the boy's sake. He walked into the darkness, each step heavier than the last, his heart a ruin of fury and grief. He didn't have the whole story yet, but one thing was clear. The boy with his eyes would give him no rest. He was tied to this place now, by blood and by lies, and he was beginning to suspect that unraveling it all would destroy what little any of them had left. She had tried so hard to forget. For 3 years, June had stitched the memory of Ray into a hidden corner of her heart. a place she never visited. But his return had ripped the stitches wide open. Lying awake in the dark, with Thomas's steady breathing on one side of her and her sleeping son on the other, the past rose up like smoke. She remembered standing on the porch of their first cabin, watching him ride away with the soldiers, his dark hair lifted in the wind, and he turned one last time, his hand raised in a silent promise. She had believed in that promise with all the fierce hope of a 19-year-old girl who thought love was a shield. The first few months were filled with that hope. She tended their garden, kept the cabin clean, and prayed every night for his safe return. Then came the first flutter of life inside her, a secret joy she whispered to the walls. Ray's child. He would be home before the baby was born. He had to be. But then came the letter. She could still feel the rough, mud-stained paper in her hands. It was delivered by a young soldier with too much pity in his eyes. Sergeant Miller, a man from the fort whose gaze always lingered a little too long when she was in town. He'd handed her the letter, his words of condolence feeling practiced and hollow. The letter itself was brutally simple. Ray had fallen in a skirmish near San Carlos, his body lost to the desert. The words blurred as she read them over and over. Bravery, service, sacrifice. They were just empty words, nails hammered into the coffin of her life. That night, the world ended. She wept until her throat was raw, clutching the quilt that still smelled of him. The baby inside her kicked, a painful reminder that she was no longer just herself. The town, which had always been suspicious, became cruel. The whispers followed her everywhere. Apache's woman, carrying his half-breed child. Soon, the whispers turned to action. A rock shattered her window one night. Men would spit on the ground as she passed. Work dried up. No one would hire the Apache's widow. By the time her belly was round and heavy, hunger was a constant gnawing companion. Loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. She was trapped, and she was terrified. Sergeant Miller started coming around, bringing scraps of food, offering his protection. His meaning was clear, and it made her skin crawl. It was in her darkest hour that Thomas appeared. She heard hooves one evening, then a knock on the door. He stood in the twilight, a sack of flour over his shoulder, his face grim. "I heard," was all he said. "About Ray. About the trouble." She tried to be proud, to tell him she needed nothing, but her voice broke, and the tears she'd been holding back betrayed her. Without another word, Thomas walked in, set the flour on her table, and then went outside and began mending the fence Miller's friends had broken the night before. He kept coming back. He split wood, patched the roof, and left food on her porch without ever asking for anything in return. He was a silent, steady presence in a world that had turned violent and ugly. When her time came, it was a nightmare. The pains tore through her for 2 days and nights during a blizzard. She screamed until she had no voice left. The neighbors closed their shutters. They would let her die. But Thomas heard. He broke the door down and found her half-conscious on the floor. He boiled water. He held her hand. He talked her through the worst of it. At dawn on the 3rd day, the baby's first cry filled the small, cold cabin. She held her son, her tiny, perfect son, and wept with a mixture of joy and unbearable grief. Ray should have been there. She looked into the baby's dark eyes and whispered his father's name. Thomas, exhausted, looked at the child with a quiet awe. "He's strong," he said, "like his father." But his gaze was hard. "June, you can't do this alone. Miller won't leave you be. The town won't let you rest. The boy needs a name, a father to protect him." She refused at first, but winter was long, and the whispers were getting louder, more dangerous. She knew Thomas was right. She and her son would be cast out, or worse. Miller was becoming more aggressive, his visits more threatening. So when Thomas asked again, his voice gentle, she said yes. Not for love, not because she had forgotten Ray. She said yes because her son's life depended on it. Thomas became her husband in name and a father in every way that mattered. He worked their small piece of land, he kept them fed, and his presence was a shield that kept the wolves at bay. He never asked for more than she could give, and in her sleep, when she sometimes whispered Ray's name, he never said a word. Now, Ray was back. A ghost returned to life. And the simple, safe world she had built with Thomas was cracking apart. When she had called Ray an old friend, the lie had tasted like ash. She was bound to Thomas by a debt she could never repay. But her heart had been buried with Ray 3 years ago, and now it was beating again, a frantic, painful rhythm in her chest. She looked at her sleeping son, his face a perfect blend of hers and the man she had lost. What would she do if Ray demanded she come back to him? What would happen to Thomas, the man who had saved her, if he knew her heart had never truly been his? The truth was a rising tide, and she knew, deep in her soul, that it was about to drown them all. Ray tried to stay away. He told himself it was their life now, a life built on a lie he had no part in. But every night, his horse would carry him to the edge of the trees overlooking their cabin. He became a shadow, a silent watcher. He saw it all. Thomas, chopping wood, his shoulders straining. June, hanging clothes, the setting sun turning her hair to gold. And the boy, always the boy, chasing chickens, tumbling in the dirt, his laughter echoing in the quiet valley. Every sound was a twist of the knife. He saw his own childhood in the boy's every move. He saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he held his head. One evening, the boy fell while trying to climb the corral fence. He let out a sharp cry, and June rushed to him. But Ray saw something else. After the first cry, the boy set his mouth in a tight line, his little face grim, refusing to cry anymore. It was an expression Ray knew intimately. He'd seen it in the mirror his whole life. It was the face of an Apache boy taught never to show pain. The suspicion that had been a spark was now a raging fire. This boy was his. He wanted to storm the cabin, to kick the door in and demand the truth. But then what? Rip a child away from the only father he'd ever known? Destroy the fragile peace this dying man had built? Honor and rage fought a war inside him. It was Thomas who ended the standoff. He came to Ray's camp one night, walking slowly out of the darkness. He didn't look like an enemy. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. In the firelight, Ray could see the sheen of sweat on his pale face. "Mind if I sit?" Thomas asked, his voice strained. Ray just nodded toward the log on the other side of the fire. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of burning wood. Then, Thomas was seized by a violent coughing fit, a deep, tearing sound that doubled him over. When he pulled his handkerchief away from his mouth, Ray saw the dark stain of blood in the firelight. "You're sick," Ray said, the words flat. Thomas managed a weak, humorless smile. "Consumption. The doc says it's a patient disease. It takes its time, but it always wins." The anger Ray had been nursing felt hollow. This was the man he had once called brother, now being eaten away from the inside. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the flames. "You've been watching. I've seen you." He looked up, and his gaze was direct. "You know, don't you?" Ray's voice was rough as gravel. "I see myself in him." Thomas nodded slowly, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "Because he's yours, Ray." The words dropped into the silence like stones. Even though he'd known, hearing it spoken aloud stole the breath from his lungs. "June didn't know she was carrying him when you left," Thomas continued, his voice low and weary. "She found out right before the letter came. She believed you were dead. And she was all alone. The folks in this town, They would have torn her apart for bearing your son. They would have driven her out into the wilderness. Ray closed his eyes. The image of a pregnant, grieving June facing that cruelty alone was a fresh kind of agony. So you stepped in. I stepped in because she needed someone. Thomas's voice cracked, the raw emotion finally breaking through. Because the boy needed a name. And because you were my friend. Did you think it was easy? Raising another man's son, hearing her whisper your name in her sleep? Knowing her heart would never really be mine? Then why? Ray demanded, his voice tight. Thomas was hit by another coughing spell. When it passed, he wiped his mouth and looked Ray straight in the eye. Because I loved her too, not like you did, but enough to keep her safe, enough to give her a life when she thought hers was over. And there was more to it than just gossip, Ray. There was a man. Sergeant Miller, the one who brought the letter. He wanted her. He was circling like a vulture. Marrying her was the only way to make him back off. The fire popped, spitting sparks into the darkness. Ray stared into the flames, his world tilting on its axis. His anger had been aimed at the wrong targets. The enemy wasn't June. It wasn't Thomas. It was a lie on a piece of paper and a man named Miller. I won't last the year, Thomas said softly, his voice fading. Maybe not even the season. When I'm gone, they'll need you. The boy. He deserves to know his real father. Ray looked at his old friend, at the hollowed-out cheeks and trembling hands, and felt a wave of guilt and sorrow so strong it nearly buckled him. Thomas had sacrificed everything, his health, his heart, his pride, all to protect what belonged to Ray. You ask a lot, Ray said, his voice hoarse. Thomas gave a faint smile. No, I'm asking you to take what's already yours, but promise me one thing. Don't make her choose between our memories. Let her keep her gratitude for me and her love for you. Don't tarnish either. He pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. Ray stood too, reaching out a hand to steady him. For a moment, they were just two friends, bound by a history that was deeper than betrayal. Take care of them, Thomas rasped. I will, Ray promised, his voice low and fierce. Thomas nodded once, then turned and walked slowly back toward the cabin, a dying man swallowed by the shadows. Ray sank back onto the log, the truth a crushing weight. The boy was his son. June was still his in her heart, and the man who had held their world together was walking toward his grave. He bowed his head, whispering to the night. God forgive us all. The news that Miller was back in town was a cold stone in Ray's stomach. This was no longer a story of lost love. It was a hunt. Winter came down from the mountains with a vengeance, wrapping the valley in ice and snow. The fire in the cabin burned constantly, but it couldn't seem to chase the chill from Thomas's bones. His cough became a constant hollow drumbeat, a soundtrack to their shrinking days. He grew frail, a shadow of the strong man he had been. June was a warrior. She fought the cold, she fought the sickness, she fought the despair that threatened to swallow them whole. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, her every action a refusal to surrender. But at night, when she thought everyone was asleep, Ray would hear her muffled sobs from the other side of the wall. He kept his promise. He stayed close, but he kept his distance, a silent guardian honoring the boundaries of a life that wasn't yet his. He chopped wood until it was stacked high against the cabin. He hunted, keeping their pantry full. When the boy would run to him, his face bright with a question about tracking or horses, Ray's heart would both swell and ache with a love he couldn't yet claim. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Thomas called him into the cabin. June stood by the hearth, her face weary but resigned. This was a moment she knew was coming. Thomas sat at the table, wrapped in a blanket, his breathing shallow. No more wasting words, he rasped, gesturing for Ray to sit. The doctor said months. I think he was being generous. He looked at June, his eyes softening. You've carried enough, June. I was only ever a placeholder. Don't say that, she whispered fiercely, tears welling in her eyes. You saved us. There's no replacing that. He managed a faint smile, then turned his gaze to Ray. But the truth is the truth. The boy is your son, and he's going to need his father. Miller knows you're back, Ray. He knows his lie is out. A cornered snake is the most dangerous kind. This was it, the final piece, the transfer of responsibility. The weight of it was immense. I am entrusting them to you, Thomas said, his voice gaining a flicker of its old strength. Not because I have to, because it's right. When I'm gone, protect them. Protect them from him. I won't fail them, Ray said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't fail you. June turned away, pressing her hand against the rough-hewn wall as if to hold herself up. Thomas reached out a trembling hand, and she knelt beside him, taking it in both of hers. June, he said, his breath catching, don't let gratitude be your cage. When I'm gone, grieve for me, but then live. Live for him. His gaze flickered toward Ray. You deserve the love you lost. Her sob broke free then, a raw, aching sound that filled the small room. She pressed his hand to her cheek. You were a good man, Thomas. The best I've ever known. The final weeks were a slow, painful farewell. The boy knew something was wrong. He would sit by Thomas's bedside, quietly offering him small treasures, a smooth stone, a bird's feather, waiting for stories the man no longer had the strength to tell. Then, one gray dawn, the end began. June woke to the sound of a terrible, rattling gasp. She lit a lamp and saw Thomas fighting for every breath. She screamed Ray's name, and he came running, bursting through the door without knocking. Thomas's eyes were glassy, but they found June, and for a moment a sliver of peace settled on his face. Time, he whispered. No, she begged, clutching his hand. Stay, please, just a little longer. He shook his head, a tiny, weak movement. No more pain. His eyes shifted, finding Ray in the dim light. Promise. Let him carry you now. Then he looked at the boy, who had toddled over from his cot, his eyes wide with fear. Tell him! Thomas gasped. Tell him! I was proud. His breath rattled one last time, and then silence. A silence heavier and more final than any storm. His hand went slack in hers. June collapsed against his chest, her weeping raw and unrestrained. The boy tugged at her sleeve, his small voice breaking the spell. Mama? Papa sleeping? Ray's heart shattered. He knelt and gathered the child into his arms, holding him tight against his chest, shielding him from the sight. He buried his face in the boy's dark hair and whispered, He loved you very much. Always remember that. He felt a rage building inside him, cold and pure. It wasn't aimed at fate or sickness. It was for Miller, the man who had set all this tragedy in motion with his selfish, poisonous lie. Thomas shouldn't have had to die like this, carrying another man's burdens. They buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the valley, the frozen ground fighting them every step of the way. Ray dug until his hands were raw and bleeding. June stood beside the open grave, pale and silent, clutching the boy's hand. As the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, they laid Thomas to rest. As they turned to leave, June stumbled. Ray caught her, his hand steady on her elbow. She leaned against him for just a moment, a silent admission of a grief too heavy to carry alone. Back in the suffocating silence of the cabin, she finally spoke. He told you, didn't he, about the boy? Yes, Ray said softly. He told me everything. Her breath shuddered out, a mix of relief and sorrow. I never meant to lie to you, Ray. I thought you were gone. I did what I had to do for our son. He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her cold, trembling hands in his. You did what was right. And Thomas, he was a better man than I ever knew. I will honor him. I will keep his promise. I will keep you safe." He paused, his gaze hardening. Starting with Miller. Her eyes widened in fear. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to end this," he said, his voice low and deadly. "For you, for the boy, and for Thomas." The time for watching was over. The time for grief would have to wait. Justice came first. The cold that followed Thomas's death was more than just winter. It was a silence in the cabin, a hollow space at the table. June moved through the days like a phantom, her grief a heavy cloak. Ray gave her space, his presence a steady, quiet promise. He was the mountain outside her window, unmoving, enduring, waiting for the storm to pass. The boy was their bridge. At night, when he cried out for the father he'd lost, Ray would go to him, humming the old Apache songs his mother had sung to him. The ancient melodies would quiet the child, a thread of blood and memory weaving them together in the dark. One night, as a blizzard howled, June spoke. "You're so careful with us." Ray looked up from the saddle strap he was mending by the fire. "Thomas asked me to be. He trusted you," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. "And I trust you, but I feel like I'm standing between two worlds, Ray. The one I lost with you, and the one I lost with him." He rose and stood before her. "You don't have to choose between ghosts. Grief needs time. But know this, June, I'm not leaving, not ever again." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time, they weren't just tears of sorrow. A tiny flicker of hope sparked in their depths. Ray knew he couldn't let them live under Miller's shadow. The next day, he rode into town. He didn't go looking for the sergeant. He let the man find him. It didn't take long. Miller, flanked by two of his cronies, cornered him outside the saloon. "Well, look what the buzzards dragged in," Miller sneered, his face flushed with whiskey and arrogance. "Come back from the dead, have you, Apache?" Ray didn't say a word. He just looked at him, his eyes flat and cold. "That woman should have been mine," Miller spat, taking a step closer. "That letter was a gift. She should have taken it, should have taken me." "The letter was a lie," Ray said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you're a coward who preys on grieving women." Miller's face turned purple with rage. He lunged. It was a clumsy, drunken swing that Ray sidestepped with ease. Ray moved like smoke and shadow, a warrior in his element. The fight was short and brutal. He disarmed Miller's friends with blinding speed, then turned his full attention to the sergeant. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hands. He left Miller broken and bleeding in the muddy street, every person in town watching from the windows and doorways. He leaned down, his face close to Miller's. "This is for Thomas," he whispered, so only the man on the ground could hear. "He died because of you. Now you're going to disappear. If I ever see your face in this valley again, the coyotes will be picking your bones clean by sunrise. Do you understand?" Miller, gasping for air, could only nod in terror. Ray stood up, turned his back on the wreck of a man, and walked away. No one said a word. They had all just witnessed the settling of a debt. When he returned to the cabin, June was waiting on the porch. She had seen the commotion from a distance, had seen him walk away. She ran to him, searching his face, his hands. "It's over," he said simply. "He won't be back." She looked at him, at the quiet, deadly force she had almost forgotten he possessed. The force he had used not for war, but to protect his family. And in that moment, something shifted. The ghosts of the past began to recede. As spring melted the snow, life began to return to the valley and to the small cabin. They worked side by side, repairing fences, planting a garden. The silence between them was no longer heavy with grief, but comfortable, filled with the shared rhythm of work. One warm evening, June took her son's hand and led him to where Ray was sitting on the porch steps. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I want to tell you about your father, your first father." The boy looked up at her, then at Ray, his dark eyes serious. June took a deep breath. "A long time ago, a brave Apache warrior loved me very much. He had to go away to a war, and while he was gone, you started growing inside me. We all thought he was gone forever, but he wasn't. The stories they told us were a lie. He came back." She squeezed the boy's hand. "Ray is your true father." The little boy stared at Ray, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, he let go of his mother's hand, scrambled across the porch, and climbed into Ray's lap. He put his small hands on Ray's cheeks and said one word: "Papa." Ray's throat closed. All the pain, all the lost years, all the anger melted away. He wrapped his arms around his child, and held on tight. "Yes, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Papa." June watched them, tears streaming down her face, but her heart was finally whole. That summer, they became a family. One afternoon, they stood on the ridge where Thomas was buried. The wind stirred the wildflowers that had grown on his grave. "I'll never forget what he did for us," June said softly. "He gave us a second chance." Ray agreed, his hand finding hers. She turned to him, her eyes clear and shining. "I loved him for his goodness, Ray, but I never stopped loving you." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Then let's begin again, not as who we were, but as who we are now." Their kiss was a promise, sealed by hardship and loss, and stronger for it. By the time autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and red, the cabin was filled with laughter. One evening, the three of them sat on the porch as the stars began to appear. The boy was half asleep in June's lap, and Ray was strumming a simple, quiet tune on an old guitar. "I used to think my life was over," June murmured, leaning her head on his shoulder. "But now I believe in tomorrow again." Ray kissed the top of her hair, his heart full. "Tomorrow is ours," he said. "We'll build it together." They held each other close, their son sleeping between them, a living symbol of a love that had survived war, lies, and even death. They were no longer ghosts haunted by the past. They were a family, forged in the heart of the unforgiving frontier, finally home. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and the strength it takes to begin again, please don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it allows me to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you for listening.